This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. This week, we have episode 360 entitled, Does Echad Imply God's Compound Unity? So, this podcast is, of course, about the oneness and unity of God, and Jews and biblical Unitarians for over 2,000 years have been in agreement that when the biblical text says that God is one, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, that this cardinal number, Echad, indicates that God is one person. But some Trinitarian apologists and internet armchair theologians, particularly those that like to populate the comment section of my YouTube channel, they have responded to this claim that's been made by Jews and Unitarians by arguing that Echad, the Hebrew word for one, doesn't always mean one single person, but it can also refer to compound unity. That's the phrase, compound unity. It's unity, but actually it's comprising of multiple things. And if Echad refers to compound unity, as this argument goes, then the Shema of Deuteronomy 6:4, which says that the Lord our God is one, is not in fact a Unitarian statement, but rather a statement about how God is a unity comprising a compound of three persons, multiple persons within that unity, particularly the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's how the argument goes by these internet theologians and Trinitarian apologists. So this week's episode is going to look at this important Hebrew adjective, the word echad, to see if it really does refer to compound unity. As we go through our study, we'll look at and interact with the strongest arguments put forth by these apologists and theologians in favor of compound unity in order to test to see if it actually can withstand scholarly scrutiny. So, does the Shema, the Creed of Israel, and the greatest commandment taught by Jesus, according to Mark chapter 12, verses 29 and following, does this Shema really teach the compound unity of God? Well, let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. So throughout this, we'll be referring to the Shema. The Shema, of course, is the shorthand of referring to the very first word in Hebrew of Deuteronomy 6:4. So in Hebrew, that is Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. That Shema is just the imperative to listen, Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. And that last word, Echad, is the cardinal number one. If you are teaching your Hebrew children how to count, and you're going to teach them 1, 2, 3, you would teach them Echad, Shenayim, and Shalosh. 1, 2, 3. If you have a Hebrew textbook, and it gives you cardinal numbers, there's a chapter on cardinal numbers, you'll see these three numbers as the first three. Echad, Shenayim, Shalosh. 1, 2, 3. And it'll go all the way up to 10, 20, as far as you want to count. Now, when the Jews translated the Hebrew into Greek, in the Septuagint, they continued to use a cardinal number. So from Deuteronomy 6:4, in Greek, it says, Akue Yisrael, Kyrios o Theos imon, Kyrios is estin, which means, listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And there in Greek we have is, which is the masculine adjective for one, indicating one masculine or male person. Now, what we need to do is we need to look at the best resources for defining a word. And with any language, we have what are called dictionaries, but within biblical languages, we have lexicons. And so we're going to look at the best lexicons, and we're going to see how they define this famous adjective, the number one, the word echad in Hebrew. So the first lexicon we'll look at, this is our first point, which is Echad in the Hebrew lexicons and dictionaries. We're going to look at the Halot lexicon. Halot is just an abbreviation, H-A-L-O-T, for the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. H-A-L-O-T is the common abbreviation for this. You'll find this in commentaries and a variety of other scholarly works. This is the standard right now for understanding biblical Hebrew and Aramaic words, is the Halot lexicon. And so we can find the word echad here, and it indicates, I'm just reading right off of the entry, so you can read along in the show notes. Make sure that you're not driving, please. It indicates that echad appears 960 times in the Hebrew Bible, and the first definition that it gives is that it is the numerical one, the numeral 1, the cardinal number 1. It indicates one single place in Genesis chapter 1, verse 9. It indicates one soul, one nephesh, meaning one single person in Leviticus 4:27. It will contrast 2 and 1, Shenayim and Echad, in Leviticus 14, verse 10. It can refer to the same law, or the one law, in Numbers 15, verse 16. It can refer to the same measure, the one measure, in Exodus 26, verse 2. And then, of course, it lists Deuteronomy 6:4, Yahweh is one. And so the first definition that the Halot lexicon gives is that it is the numeral 1. The second definition is that it could refer to one another. So like in Exodus chapter 17, verse 12, where we have one here and one there, using the cardinal number echad. It could mean one to another in Job 41, verse 8, or one to another in 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 3. It could be one and then to another in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 29. And you get the sense there. It's one person, and then you have another distinguished from that first subject. The third definition is that echad functions as the indefinite article, meaning one something or a particular thing or a particular person. So it appears this way in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1, in 1 Kings chapter 13, verse 11, and of course in the Hebrew sections of Daniel, like Daniel chapter 8, verse 3. So it could mean a single day, one day in 1 Samuel 27, verse 1. And so it functions in that kind of indefinite way that we are familiar with in English. It could be an ordinal number. Ordinal is like first, second, and third, as compared to the cardinal numbers, which is 1, 2, and 3. So the fourth definition that the Halot lexicon gives is the ordinal number first. So it'll refer to the first of many things in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 2, or the first day, day 1, Yom Echad, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 5, or the first day of the month in Ezra chapter 10, verse 16. The fifth definition it gives is that it could be a distributive number, as in one in each tribe, like in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 23, or from each man in 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 20, or one after the other in Isaiah chapter 27, verse 12, or each single one in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 6. So those are all the definitions that the Halot lexicon gives, and we could see that's just the common normal way in which people would use the cardinal number 1 or the ordinal number first. But what I don't find is any mention of compound unity. That is just simply not mentioned within this lexicon. But maybe it's mentioned in another lexicon. So let's look at the other famous Hebrew lexicon. We're going to look at the BDB, the Brown, Driver, and Briggs Hebrew lexicon. This lexicon is over 100 years old, and it was the standard until we uncovered the Hebrew text in Qumran the text from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which kind of revolutionized our understanding of Hebrew, and that's why it's in some sense a little bit outdated, but it was the standard, and it's practically in public domain at this particular point. But I want to see where this argument came from for compound unity. So, in the BDB, the abbreviation for the Brown, Driver, and Briggs Hebrew and English lexicon, we have Echad showing up here. It indicates that it's an adjective, and it is the number 1. That's very important. So the first definition that the BDB lexicon gives is that it is just 1, the number 1. And it gives a variety of verses for that. Again, no surprise there. The second definition it gives is that it could refer to each or every, as in the way of saying each as in like one of this and one of that. The third definition is that it could refer to a certain one or a certain thing. The fourth definition, as we saw in the earlier lexicon, is that it could refer to the indefinite article. The fifth definition could be only, as in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 19, or the word once, as in one particular time in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 10. The seventh definition is that it could refer to the ordinal number first, as we saw in a variety of passages. The eighth definition is that in combination, so in Hebrew what they do is they won't have the number for 11, it'll have the number for 1 and 10 together. So of course the word for 11, it's going to have Echad and Ashar, which is the cardinal number for 10. So 1 and 10 makes 11. So it functions in the combination there. And those are the only definitions that it gives, 8 definitions. But again, there is a complete absence from any discussion, suggestion, or hint that Echad could refer to compound unity. That language is just simply not there within the lexicons. Now, I also wanted to look at a theological dictionary. So there is the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology. It's abbreviated as the NIDOTT, International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology. And as I'm glancing over at my bookshelf, it looks like that it is in 5 volumes, 5 green volumes, and it has Echad there. Surprising that a cardinal number is going to appear in a dictionary of theology, but wanted to make sure that we are clear on this. And so I'm just going to read to you the entry. It says Ehad, which is an adjective meaning 1, a cardinal number, first, an ordinal number, each, a certain, only, once, first, a few, and that's the definitions that it gives. In the Old Testament, it says that as well as being a cardinal, 1, and ordinal, first or first one, number, Echad can be an adjective, a single, unique, singular, a certain, or each, or a nominative, a single individual or a single thing, one time or once each other. As a simple cardinal number, it occurs in the list in Joshua chapter 12, verses 9 through 24. The first day is often significant starting point, whether in creation, like in Genesis chapter 1, verse 5, or of the month in Genesis chapter 8, verse 13. The tabernacle was set up on the first day of the first month, Exodus chapter 40, verse 17, and Hezekiah's sanctifying of the temple began on the same date, 2 Chronicles 29, verse 17. So, again, we have all the information that we've seen thus far in the Halot and the BDB dictionary, but again, we find absolutely no mention of compound unity. And so the suggestion that Echad actually means more than 1, it's just a unity as opposed to the cardinal number 1, as in 1 minus the second cardinal number, 2. The suggestion that this is actually a reference to compound unity is just simply not there in the lexicons. It's not there in the theological dictionaries. That definition does not technically exist. So let's move to our next point, point number 2, which is that arguments for Echad meaning compound unity, because I felt the best way to interact with an opposing view is to take the best arguments that they have, to listen to them, to look at their reasons, and to interact with those arguments. And so typically there are going to be two verses, two out of the nearly 1,000 occurrences of Echad that we already saw, two verses that are trotted out to argue that Echad really does mean more than one, and that Echad means a compound unity. Therefore, we should read Deuteronomy 6:4 to where Yahweh is one, to not refer to one person, but a compound unity that is three persons. So the first verse that gets trotted out is Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. This passage says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Genesis 2, verse 24. And so the one flesh here is Echad. We have the noun flesh. We have the adjective modifying the word flesh. The adjective is Echad. And so you have two persons, the man and the woman, coming together to be one flesh. So how is one functioning here? Well, it refers to one flesh. It doesn't refer to multiple fleshes. But the flesh here is not that two people come together and they're now a new thing, a new being. The one flesh here implies a unity of purpose. It implies a unity of marriage and a unity of intimacy. This is not a unity of being in the sense that we have multiple persons in one being. Flesh is not a being in the sense that God is a being. And so I don't know if this parallel really helps with understanding Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, to where there's no mention of multiple persons. There's no two or three in the context of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. So yeah, we have one flesh comprising two persons, but this is not one being. This is not one thing. It's a unified marriage. It's a unity of intimacy and purpose. It's not multiple persons in one being. The next passage that gets trotted out is Numbers chapter 13, verse 23, where it says, "They came to the valley of Lexical and cut down from there a branch with a single cluster of grapes." Numbers chapter 13, verse 23. So we have a single cluster of grapes. The word for single is the cardinal number Echad. So we have one cluster of grapes, but within that single cluster, within the one cluster, there are many grapes. One cluster of grapes is a single entity, but it's made up of many grapes. And so the argument goes that we can have one comprising of many. And they say, look, therefore, compound unity is biblical. But this is not really the same thing that we see in Deuteronomy 6:4, and it's really not the same thing that we see in the Chalcedonian Creed. This is not multiple persons comprising a single being. This is grapes in a cluster. It's not saying that one grape means multiple grapes. So using Numbers 13, verse 23 to interpret Deuteronomy 6:4 is kind of like comparing apples to oranges, or in this case, comparing grapes to God. It's not really a good comparison, and it doesn't indicate that Echad really is referring to one being, but multiple persons. So the arguments that are brought forth from Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, and Numbers 13, verse 23, don't demonstrate that Echad can really mean more than one person. That's not what the argument is saying. The cardinal number Echad possesses really at its core the basic meaning that is still one. That's the common meaning. That's the basic dictionary definition. There is no contextual evidence for compound unity in Deuteronomy 6:4. In Deuteronomy 6:4, where it says that the Lord our God is one, it's not qualified in any sort of way to say that one means more than one, or there's a plurality that is there. The Targums don't say this. The Septuagint doesn't say this. When it gets quoted in the New Testament, in Mark chapter 12, verse 29, or in Romans chapter 3, or Galatians chapter 3, or James chapter 2, none of those authors think that the oneness really means three, or the oneness is a compound unity. Ancient people just never interpret it this way. So let's move to our conclusions. What have we observed thus far? No Hebrew lexicon mentions compound unity at all. It's not even a possible definition to choose from. So those who insist that Echad refers not to a cardinal number one, but instead to compound unity, are inventing a definition to suit their own theology. Furthermore, these interpreters are in fact guilty of imposing a later theological framework onto the text of the Hebrew Bible rather than deriving it directly from the text itself. The next conclusion is that God in the Bible is never described with the cardinal number 3. Never once. If the Shema is really a passage indicating compound unity, and that the oneness is really a oneness in being, but a plurality of persons, 3 persons in particular, you would expect God to be defined clearly and unambiguously in a variety of passages to be 3 persons. But there's no text anywhere in the Old Testament, in the intertestamental period, or in the New Testament that describes Yahweh, the God of Israel, as 3 persons. The cardinal number 3 is never once associated with any of the words for God, whether that be Yahweh, Elohim, Adonai, or Theos in the New Testament. God is never once described with the number 3. But we can be absolutely confident that Echad means one person when it's used to describe the God of Israel because of the 20,000 plus singular references to Yahweh in the Bible, which is statistically the most important stat that we have on the biblical Unitarian argument. God is described with 20,000 plus singular pronouns, singular verbs, singular adjectives, and singular suffixes, indicating that God is only one person. So God is described over 20,000 times as one single undivided person, and never once is he described with the cardinal number 3. Therefore, Echad in Deuteronomy 6:4 means that God is one person, Yahweh alone, the only God, and it is not an argument for compound unity, which is not a biblical argument. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Please join us next week as we examine 1 John chapter 5, verse 20 to see if the passage really does call Jesus the true God. Please look forward to our next episode. If you enjoy our podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. You can support us absolutely for free by subscribing, by giving us an honest review, and by sharing your favorite episodes on social media. If you want to throw us a few dollars as a donation, you can check out the episode description for a PayPal link, or you can subscribe on YouTube with one of 2 membership options. And if you want to get in a donation before the end of the year for tax purposes, be sure to do so before January 1st. The Biblical Unitarian Podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am Dustin Smith, your host. Until next time, take care.